Tell me not in mournful numbers, life is but an empty dream, for the soul is dead that slumbers, and things are not what they seem. Life is real, life is earnest, and the grave is not its goal. Dust thou art, to dust returneth, was not spoken of the soul.
A story can be told. A story can be told of how modern education lost its way in the purposes of intellectual and moral wisdom. I would argue that classical education is uniquely poised now to respond.
We've taken it upon ourselves to gather this big tent of classical educators from across the country to really go deeper, to understand better the tradition that we've inherited and the resources needed to sustain it.
Classical education considers knowledge, for all its uplift and liberation, to be a precursor to wisdom.
If you want to know what a school really believes, look at how the adults treat one another. Look at how they work together. Look at how they speak to one another. And look at how they have built the systems to deeply love one another where they're at.
He said, you know that you're more than a bird because God will send people to love you. And from preschool to law school, God always sent people like you to love me.
A good education is one that ultimately gives the individual an opportunity to flourish as an adult, irrespective of where life's journey takes them.
We're not just giving them knowledge either. We're also trying to develop them morally. We're trying to develop them into something other than what they are now, so that they can go out into the world later and be somebody.
I am glad for my heart. I am glad for my heart.
Our work today is to engage our time with the resources that we have, to be hopeful, forward-looking, and to know that the lessons of the past are ours to be prudently deployed for generations of students ahead. Brothers and sisters, we have an essential part to play in an unfinished history. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Can you please take your seats? Thank you. I'm absolutely thrilled to see this room filling up in all corners of the rooms. It's very exciting. We're all very, very happy that you're here. Hello, let me introduce myself. I know a few people have stopped me and said, you're Carol McNamara. And that's true, I am Carol McNamara. And I'm the director of the Great Hearts Institute, which produces this event and brings you all here. I would like to welcome you to the 2026 Great Hearts National Symposium for Classical Education. We are absolutely thrilled that you've made it to Arizona and Symposium through whatever stormy, blustery challenges and weather you have had to endure to join us here, where the sun is definitely waiting for you. And yes, I ordered the sun. And so far, so good for me. Thank you. I want to, just in case I forget, I'll probably say this frequently throughout the week. I want to thank our speakers, and our sponsors who come from near and far to support the classical education conversation at our Big Tent Symposium. We are all here because we believe that K-12 education should introduce students to the best that has been thought and said by the greatest minds in conversation with one another over the centuries and across our curriculum. We've had a few unavoidable changes in the symposium schedule this week. Jeffrey Rosen, sadly, is unable to deliver the keynote address this evening due to a family medical emergency. We are, however, profoundly fortunate to have Chris Perrin here, who will kick off our proceedings in just a little while. More about Chris soon. And on Friday morning, Susan McWilliams-Bart will deliver the concluding keynote address on the topic of Exodus and the American founding. I'm very excited about that as well, and I'm very grateful that she was willing to sort of, what did she say, amp up her breakout session to sort of step up and be our keynote speaker. Our charge this year is to celebrate the 250th birthday of the Declaration of Independence and the American experiment that it set in motion. Shortly before his death, fittingly on July 4th, 1826, responding to the accusation that the Declaration of Independence was imitative, Thomas Jefferson famously explained that the Declaration's purpose was, quote, not to discover new principles, but to place before mankind the common sense of the subject. It was intended to be an expression of the American mind. Here at Symposium this week, our goal is to approach the semi-quincentennial, yes, I learned that big word this year, in the same spirit, to examine and understand more fully the role a liberal arts education should have in the formation of the American mind. The formation of students to be free people in both mind and heart, prepared for the perennial experiment of self-government and the spirit that leads to human flourishing. And that's what all of our workshops and panel discussions, our speakers, our keynote speakers and addresses are here to do throughout this week. I'm excited to hear as many of the sessions as I can get to, and I'm excited to hear how you receive them. I have a couple of reminders before I start the introductions. First of all, if you have not done so already, please download the Symposium app. It can be, well, you have two Bibles. This Bible is a little bit out of date now, but it's really nice and colorful, and it has the program. But also the app is important because you can reserve your spot in sessions, and you have it right on your phone. So, and we will be sending announcements through the app. So it's useful to have on your phone. The QR code is in the program, and you can download the app that way. There are signs around as well. Also, remember that we're starting bright and early at 8:30 tomorrow morning with Doug Lemov's keynote address, The Science of Reading Books. We also have Wi-Fi that is powered by Alexandria. So please, when you go in, you can choose the Symposium Wi-Fi and use the Powered by Alexandria password. Finally, I want to remind you to visit all of our sponsors. We are so lucky to have a great variety of sponsors who are here to support us and to engage with you. So please visit all of our sponsors here in the foyer and also in the cloister, and especially during the reception and all of our different breaks. Okay, now on to our various speakers tonight. First of all, I'd like to introduce and bring to the stage Jay Heiler. Jay Heiler is our CEO and the co-founder of Great Hearts Academies. Jay?
Thank you, Carol. Good evening, and let me add my welcome to the Great Hearts Annual Symposium on classical education. And as ever, we should begin with gratitude. And we have great gratitude for Carol and McNamara. McNamara is the leader of this band that pulls together this event every year and works so very hard to curate it with love and foresight and execute it with competence and precision. She has lots of help from people like Helen Baxendale and Jake Tawney, Dan Scoggin, and many others at Great Hearts that I necessarily have to overlook in the interest of time. But thank you to all of you who have worked so hard in making this event ready for all of us. So again, we begin, as ever, with gratitude, in this case for you. Your presence and the commitment of time and effort to join us are appreciated. These are a grace and a first contribution. And now that you're here, please add the gifts of your engagement, your confidence in our common purpose to advance classical education, and your highest thoughts and observations as to how we might succeed in that work beyond all expectations. Rather like the United States of America itself, which across its first 250 years has succeeded beyond all expectations. And that brings us to our timely theme for this year's convening. When the Continental Congress of 1776 set forth the Declaration of Independence, prospects, and so we should recall that the Declaration was not only a cry of principle, but also a cry for help in the face of a fearsome and mortal reality. In fact, it's true to hold that for all its moral and civic weight, the Declaration's first intended audiences, the candid world to which it refers itself, were the ministerial courts of France and Spain. Both nations answered the call, the Spaniards perhaps less famously than the French, but both with significant consequence, which points us toward an element of the story that is less civic than religious. It has not been widely noted in the common treatments of the history, but the new American world first formed as a defiant Protestant pilgrimage, and now born into a kind of Protestant nationhood, in rebellion against its Protestant mother country, straightaway went looking for its Catholic allies. If the abuses and usurpations of the British regime were to be halted and the new nation formed, and the necks of the signers spared, it was going to take a hand from, of all people, the loathsome papists. Any port in a storm. And as we would later come to say in the American South, don't that beat all? Now, what I hope to enter into this evening's conversation, however, is less about geopolitics and rebellion and alliances of convenience, and more about philosophy, shared philosophy. Still, for the most striking thing about America's Declaration of Independence is its enunciation of philosophical first things which came to American shores and the American mind, as Carol said, by way of Rome, and not by Rome only, as we all here know, but Jerusalem, was lifted and educated toward his talents by Presbyterian minister Hugh Knox, whose mercy extended to a 10-year-old boy in the West Indies, whose father had abandoned him, his brother, and their young mother. Then, a couple of years later, at 12, Alexander would lose his mother as well to yellow fever and a death in her 30s. Having been born out of wedlock, illegitimate as such a circumstance used to be called, he was ineligible for any financial bequest. But he did inherit 34 books his mother had kept in the house. All the titles are not known, but the best evidence is they included the Iliad, the Odyssey, and Plutarch's Lives. And so those books in due course proved to be far more valuable than money, not only to Hamilton, but to us. As for the primary drafter of the Declaration, Thomas Jefferson, he too had several clergymen to thank for his classical education, which he would later put in the service of vehement, if not treacherous, political opposition to Hamilton. which, by the way, goes to refute any assertion one might hear, and one does hear, that classical education results in everyone thinking alike. At any rate, that is all beside the central point, which is this. The Declaration adopted by the Second Continental Congress 250 years ago, as drafted by Thomas Jefferson and edited by the body, was firmly grounded in 3,000 years of Western thought and moral tradition. Our nation's founding document was itself an exercise in classical education, as well as its product. The claim to independence from the British Crown is explicitly grounded in natural law, and natural law, in turn, declared to be authored by God. And then there are the related articulations of government by consent of the governed, and God as the source and grantor of human rights. All of that is a kind of preamble to a royal indictment of some 27 counts, more or less, of various offenses. Most are civic in nature, so-called injuries and usurpations, amounting to wide abuse of power. But also included are several things which mainly amount to theft, violations of the 8th commandment, thou shalt not steal, and another pertaining to the 6th, thou shalt not kill. So the notion of private property was put down in Judaic law no fewer than 3,000 years before it was further lodged as an element and right of liberty in the 5th Amendment to the United States Constitution. Likewise, the sanctity of innocent life, which under the aforementioned natural law, including but not limited to the Mosaic Decalogue, was considered given by God and therefore his only to take. Now you 900 or so souls who gather here and now in State 48, of which our founders did not remotely dream, go to work every day dreaming of every child receiving his or her own classical education, and thus a deep encounter with truth, goodness, and beauty, timeless and transcendent, ever ancient and ever new. And doing so, we know we face an entrenched resistance from a determined opposing force and counter-philosophy. And no, I am not speaking of the teachers' unions. Although they certainly are entrenched, the teachers' unions do not represent the real opponent. Rather, they venerate it and raise it up. The real opponent is a crass and proud utilitarianism, which discards truth and rejects the timeless and transcendent to whatever some bureaucrat in power or some fashion in style decides will work. Now, I realize you all know this, but I want to share something here in our 250th year as a nation that many do not know or may have forgotten. The utilitarian opponent is not new. In fact, it was always there from the beginning, from all beginnings, and so from the beginning of America. This requires a brief historical note through which we will bring these opening remarks to a close and get you all on to a much more erudite speaker. Some years back, when thinking about the Declaration, I realized I had never learned much of its immediate aftermath. I found myself wondering how the British must have first reacted to it. And react they did in a way that you all may find interesting. Forget the redcoats and the muskets and the Hessians and General Cornwallis and all that for a minute. First thing, and I'm not joking here, the British ran out and hired a lawyer. Yes, the Prime Minister brought a lawyer to a gunfight. They called them barristers, who moonlighted this barrister as a pamphleteer and propagandist. His name was John Lind. John Lind's job was to get busy, hurry up, and write a response to the Declaration. And boy, did he ever. He must have been billing by the hour or by the word, because the barrister's response to the Declaration is about 49 times longer than the Declaration itself. It should be a first clue as to its quality, most teachers will know. It is long and it is tedious. It's so laboriously long and tedious that I don't know how we haven't put it on the Great Hearts reading list. Maybe we can all decide to make it detention reading. Anyway, Barrister Lind is tasked with writing up this long response to the Declaration, and the candid world is waiting, and he needs a hand. So where to turn for help? Why, you turn to your friend, right? Your best friend. In fact, your roommate. And Barrister Lind's best friend and roommate, he wasn't just anybody. He just happened to be someone all of you have heard something about, although maybe not this. Barrister Lind's best friend was a stylish intellectual of the 18th century, still lionized by the Illuminati of our own day. His name was Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham is considered the father of utilitarianism, although upon reflection, one might go all the way back to Eden to justly assign that distinction. There were 4 parties present in the garden, and 3 of them were utilitarians. But back to Bentham, who, as you know, asserted that man's only end and purpose is pleasure, or the absence of pain. Nothing was or is right or wrong under his creed, nothing actually true or good or beautiful, except pleasure. A game of pushpin, he famously said, is of equal value with the arts and sciences of music and poetry. So you could say it figures that Bentham wouldn't have much cared for the Declaration and its assertions of natural law and right and moral principle and self-evident truths. And not only that, and perhaps this is what really chapped his pompous backside, assertions made at the risk and, quote, subversive of every actual or imaginable kind of government. They have outdone the utmost extravagance of all former fanatics. Along with the mockery and derision, he also told a few lies, but then so what, so long as it amused him and pleased him. And Bentham's last pleasure, sad to say, this takes us from the 6th and 8th commandments all the way up to number 1. He wrote hundreds of exacting words as to how, down to every detail, upon his death, his body was to be dissected, mummified, preserved, and placed on display, quote, in the attitude in which I am sitting when engaged in thought, unquote. And believe it or not, there Bentham's rotten corpse does still sit in honored display at University College London. There it sits as an unintended monument, not to Bentham, as he envisioned, but to the hollowed-out scholastic forms his thought would devolve to most universities and thus upon the Western world. So friends, as we continue about our work here in this, here's that out-of-town word again for a 250th anniversary, our semi-quincentennial, and we celebrate this anniversary of our great and free nation, I want to tell you, don't let the utilitarians get you down. Remember that they were always there, always with their own declaration, always vending their insidious manifesto. They were there at the dawn of our nation, and they were there at the dawn of the human event. And make no mistake, they will have a response to our declarations just like they had a response to Jefferson's. Remind them gently, if you can, that if the opposite of love is hate, the absence of love is use. Remember that many are lost, that there but for the grace of God go we, and keep hope, keep lighting a path that they might walk ahead and yet be found. And finally, as you consider the schools that tragically flounder and fail, and all the running fads that corrode them from the inside, remember the comic and cosmic irony at which we should all laugh. In the end, One of the major problems with utilitarianism is that it just doesn't work. Thank you. I appreciate again all of your presence here more than we can say on behalf of everyone at Great Hearts, and appreciate still more the work that every one of you is doing in your theater to lend yourselves to this cause. Hope you have a wonderful evening and 2 days.
Thank you, Jay. I would like now to turn to our entertainment for this evening before we bring up our keynote speaker. We'd like to introduce a performance by our own Scottsdale Preparatory Academy Chamber Singers under the direction of Mr. Robin Neely. Each year they perform at the NAU Jazz Madrigal Festival, consistently taking home superior rankings in both jazz and madrigal. They also spend a day in the GCU recording studio, recording their repertoire and creating memories for a lifetime. They're excited to perform here tonight at the symposium, Avalon, originally written by Al Jolson, Buddy DeSilva, and Vincent Rose. The original arrangement was by Ray Charles, but this arrangement was by Darman Meter.
Good evening. My name is Jake Tawney. I'm the Chief Academic Officer for Great Hearts. It's my distinct honor to welcome you, along with others, to our symposium this year. It's hard to believe that it was just 2016 in October that there were 40 people huddled into small conference rooms in Veritas at the very first symposium. And it's my distinct pleasure, and with all kudos to Carol, to announce that this is the first year that we've topped 900 registrants. I will keep my comments quite short, but just perhaps remind the audience the same thing I remind you every year, that ultimately what we do is about our students and then, of course, about our teachers. That this event is for you, the teachers. You have the noblest and most important career in our country. So please help me welcome all of the teachers. You should also know that when Carol says she brought the good weather, this is true, because last week it was awful. The high was something like 68. And my wife and I had to go find jackets to take our evening walk. So thank goodness we've put that behind us for this week's beautiful weather. On the note of teachers, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Andrew Zorneman. I've invited Andrew up, who's a good friend of Great Hearts over the years, to introduce us to really what is a monumental resource for both teachers and students in his History 250 series.
Thank you, Jake. Good evening, everyone. Such a great pleasure and an honor to be here tonight. Following Jay Heiler especially, it really is a remarkable achievement that America is 250 years old. Walter McDougall, the historian, says the most important event in all of modern history is the establishment of the American Republic, which for all intents and purposes begins with the Declaration of Independence. So we have a lot to celebrate, but we celebrate at a time of urgency, because in some ways America is more divided than ever. In some ways, America is really suffering from a great forgetfulness. In the 1990s, our great and most popular historian, David McCullough, and in losing its story, it's losing a sense of national identity. In his 2021 book, The Dying Citizen, Victor Davis Hanson said, way too many Americans simply don't know how we got to where we are today, and in turn, have forgotten their responsibilities as citizens. At Kane Academy, which has been devoted since 2016 to pump life into the humanities, we decided we're going to do something about that, to help Americans remember what they ought to remember. And so we started church groups, and every kind of group across the United States where people want to remember and need to remember our shared past. Without further ado, let me introduce our new trailer for History 250.
On July 4th, 2026, America turns 250. In celebration of this remarkable achievement, History 250 is telling America's remarkable story, one film at a time. We begin at the beginning, with the first Americans, the first explorers, settlers, missionaries, the founding fathers, and the revolutionary generation, the great waves of immigrants, the great migration west. We tell the stories of what Americans did first. They created the most enduring modern republic and the most influential written constitution in any age. America was not the first to have slavery or fight a civil war, but it was the first and only nation to fight a civil war to end slavery. Americans were the first to build a transcontinental railroad, first to fly an airplane, first to fly solo nonstop across the Atlantic, and first to break the sound barrier. First to win gold medals in the decathlon and pentathlon at a single Olympic Games, or 4 gold medals across sprint, relay, and jumping events. The first and only country to land a man on the moon. We tell the stories of everyday Americans doing extraordinary things. Their work made America, plowing their farms, building their cities, teaching their children, healing their sick. Their courage sustained America in the face of suffering, in times of war, natural disaster, disease, and economic hard times. Their love expanded American life, the love of cars and the great American road, the love for music that makes us dance, the films that catch our imaginations, sports that make us cheer, and art that stirs our sympathies. The love we have for a meaningful past and for a better tomorrow. The love of God, the love of family, the love of liberty. America's story can slip away, so can our sense of who we are, which is why Theodore Roosevelt signed into law the Antiquities Act of 1906, which allowed Americans to preserve our cultural treasures. It is why, in the sober expectation that some would later deny what happened in the past, General Eisenhower directed American forces to record what they saw when liberating the camps at the end of World War II. And it is why Americans create and preserve monuments, museums, and historic sites across the land where our ancestors carved out a life of freedom. It is why we return to hallowed ground, where our fellow countrymen gave the last full measure of their devotion to the cause of freedom. As America turns 250, let's remember how we got to where we are today. The one-of-a-kind places, the unrepeatable events, and the unrepeatable lives at the heart of those events. Their story is our story, what unites us to our past and to one another.
Bill McClay says it's perfectly natural to love what is yours. And I hope that History 250, if it accomplishes nothing else, increases the love that all of us have for our country. Again, all the resources are free. We have 50 episodes of History 250 that have gone live. If you go to the landing page for History 250, you will find there's a link there for downloadable versions of the films. So if you want to use the films in the classroom, you can download them to your computer, and it makes it very easy to create a really good lesson plan from that. We'll be creating more films, and right now you might want to know that the last episode opened the Civil War. So the Battle of Fort Sumter just happened in episode 50. We think it's a great project. We hope it's of great service to you and to all of our fellow Americans. Happy birthday to everybody, and let's celebrate really well. Thank you.
As Carol said, we of course are very grateful for all of our sponsors, among which is Cana Academy. This evening we have two very generous classical sponsors bringing us the keynote. The first is the Salmon P. Chase Center for Civics, Culture, and Society, which was established in 2023 by the state of Ohio. OH, thank you, it's always some. To teach the historical ideas, traditions, and texts that have shaped the American constitutional order and society. Like its namesake, the Chase Center recognizes that American citizenship is a high calling, one for all Americans. Following in Chase's footsteps, the Chase Center is a robust academic community dedicated to the research and scholarship, teaching, and service in the field of civic thought, education, and leadership. And we have Lee Strang and his lovely wife, and also Christopher Green here from the Salmon P. Chase Center. So join me in thanking them for tonight's sponsorship. We also have joining them in the sponsorship the fairly new Humanitas Institute, which is an organization that has stepped forth to ignite and increase awareness of the renewal of classical education in the United States and abroad. They do this by creating national class media, including short video documentaries that show, rather than tell, the blessings and benefits of a classical education. They also produce 2 premier podcasts, publish a weekly collection of articles from leaders in the classical education renewal, and host a robust classical school finder on their website. See what they're building at humanitasinstitute.org, and come visit them here also at the symposium and tell them your story. So once again, please join me in thanking the Humanitas Institute. Chris Perrin. There's this introduction that I'm supposed to read, and I suppose I will do that, but then I'm going to have some other things to say. Chris Perrin is the CEO of Classical Academic Press and a national leader, author, and speaker for the renewal of classical education. He is the author of a slew of books, including An Introduction to Classical Education, a guide for parents, Greek for children, The Scholae Way, and co-author of the relatively new and tremendous book, The Good Teacher, 10 Key Pedagogical Principles That Will Transform Your Teaching. Christopher serves as a consultant to classical Christian schools throughout the country, schools that are converting to the classical model, and homeschool co-ops. He is the board president of the Alcuin Fellowship, former co-chair of the Society for Classical Learning, and an adjunct professor with the honors program at Messiah College and with the Classical School Leadership Master's program at Gordon College. Chris previously served, perhaps most importantly, for 10 years as a headmaster of a classical school in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. That's the official. What I really want to say is that Christopher Perrin is a giant in the movement. He is an important personal mentor for me, and most importantly, along with Joel Hodge and Jesse Hake from Classical Academic Press, a tremendous and close friend. I will also say that if you ever find yourselves in or near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, nobody does hospitality like Christopher Perrin. There will always be food and good red wine. And without further ado, Christopher Perrin.
Good evening. Yes, red wine. And now we know what happiness is. You know, when I hear about Jeremy Bentham, and then I hear the choir, something came to mind. You know, it was Hamlet who said, to be or not to be, that is the question. And I think Bentham would have said, do, don't be. Do, don't be. But the classical liberal art of music answers and harmonizes those concerns in a jazz-like way by saying doobie, 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 doobie. Before I get started, I just want to say, yes, the Humanitas Institute is new. Check out their table, check out their website. And also, you've seen a book on your seat that's also called Humanitas, and that's published by Classical Academic Press. Take one of those with you. And if you're interested in any curricula that CAP has, you can get any evaluation copy that you'd like for free. So we're giving away a lot of books at our booth, but also we'll send them to you by free, and there's a QR code for that. And then lastly, our platform, Classical U, is also available 1 month free. There's a discount code you can use if you want to check out the new Classical U. It's just been recoded. It's Great Hearts 26 to get a month free on Classical U. You know, if we're going to renew classical education, we have to know what it is. And we keep asking this question, what is it? And tonight I'm going to be speaking to you about the history of classical education. And it's a challenging thing because, well, history contains everything. Founders like Jefferson and Franklin, who helped craft our Declaration, were inheritors of a tradition, just like we are inheritors of a tradition. And we've come to speak about our work as a renewal. But classical education is a tradition. It's multifaceted, it's multidimensional. And so we ought to try to define it, even though it's difficult. When I think about this, I'm reminded of Augustine, who said about time, I know what it is until you ask me to define it. I know what classical education is, I think, until you ask me to define it. If we are in the midst of a renewal of classical education, what is it that we're trying to renew? This is a question that we're asked every day by parents when they come knocking at the doors of our schools. And if we're honest, it's a question we keep asking ourselves, don't we? What is this tradition? We're trying to answer it better than we did yesterday, especially when we realize we don't really know what we're doing. Trying to give to our students, so many of us, what we haven't received ourselves. W. Kane, a historian of education from the last generation, says that the wealth of past experience is like wealth hidden in a mine, of service only to him who digs it out, and only so far as he knows or learns how to use it. Maybe you didn't think about it this way, but we're engaged in an archaeological project. Asking, what is classical education, is like asking, what is democracy? What is medicine? What is health? What is religion? What's Christianity? What, after all, is politics? Because it's big, long, deep, and broad, and because it's the formation of a human being. We might as well ask for a pithy definition of how to raise a family. It can't be that hard, right? Just make sure they go to bed on time. Get good sleep. That's all you need to know. Do you think there's a satisfactory one-sentence answer to the question, what is classical education? Do you think there can be a lecture that will be sufficient, or even a conference? Is there even a sufficient book? The answer is yes. It's called The Liberal Arts Tradition, published by Classical Academic Press. You might think at first, it can't be that hard. After all, you went to school, you were educated, and you turned out okay. I used to think that. But then why can't you name the liberal arts? And if you can name them, why is it that you can't define them? How is geometry different from astronomy? Can logic be part science and part art, or is it just a liberal art? And what makes it liberal? And why is music considered mathematics? And why is it that you don't know how they came about in the first place? You don't know why they're called liberal, or why they're called arts and not sciences. And why is it that you love literature, but you can't recite a single poem? Or why is it that you teach science, but you don't know when it was that scientists weren't even called scientists at all, but philosophers, natural philosophers? Why did Newton call himself a natural philosopher and not a scientist? And why is it that you know that philosophy means a love of wisdom, but you can't easily define wisdom or distinguish it from prudence? And why is it that you pride yourself in speaking well, but you don't know the difference between a preposition and a predicate, or a figure and a trope, and can't name the rhetorical figure that I'm using right now? And why aren't you curious about the language behind your language, your grandmother tongues of Greek and Latin? And why do you confess to others that you are not a math person, when clearly, if you are a human, you reason with number and you delight in number, which is why you love music, which is the incarnation of math? But then why didn't you know that? You say you love Shakespeare, or you pretend to, because you never really got Shakespeare. It's popular in classical circles to say you like Shakespeare or pretend that you do. Well, I could go on berating our ignorance, an ignorance that I share. In many cases, we don't know what we don't know, and yet we presume to be teachers. If you think you've been well educated, even if you have been, something is off. Something is off morally. You should have long ago encountered one of the first paradoxes of learning, which is this: the more you learn, the more you become cognizant of your ignorance. As the circumference of your learning grows, the boundary of your ignorance expands accordingly. The more you know you don't know. Socrates articulated this some 2,500 years ago. Solomon put it this way: the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. But even Solomon, some say the wisest who ever lived, regarded himself always as a beginner. And if you doubt that, read the book of Ecclesiastes. The educated person does exist, but he or she is always someone besides yourself. Interview the educated person. She will tell you that she is still a beginner. If you think she is wise, and she really is wise, she will contradict you and tell you that she is not wise. This is the primal paradox of education. Our greatest teachers, whom we hold up, regard themselves as perpetual students. How about you? If we're to successfully restore classical education, we'll have to be so wise as to think ourselves fools. At the very least, we'll have to regard ourselves as perpetual students and shudder to be called educators of the young. Socrates preferred the terms gadfly and midwife. Socrates said his wisdom was his knowledge that he didn't have any. And yet for all this paradox, we also have to confess that we seek to cultivate wisdom in our students, and that this is the chief aim of classical education. And so the paradox doubles. We who cannot think ourselves wise must be models of wisdom to our students. And this, in fact, is the reality. So often, reality is paradoxical. Like light, which they say is both particles and waves at the same time. It's the way of human growth and education. It's the model of Socrates. It's the model of Solomon. It's the model of Christ. The humble must be our teachers, for the humble have seen more greatness than we have. Such greatness that they must always regard themselves as small. If you encounter a classical teacher who boasts or insinuates that he is well educated and wise, you should find another. For he's not truly a teacher in the classical tradition. He has not truly been in the grand museum that would have made him small. Or perhaps he's turned the museum into an emporium for picking up snacks, like a quick run to the convenience store. He thinks he is present to bless when he is not blessed. And we all remember the bit about millstones being thrown around the necks of those who mislead the young. Anyone who would stand in front of a class of young students and teach should do so as Socrates or Solomon or Christ. Anything good can be corrupted. Anything good can be corrupted, including classical. Can't observe it, making it out of bounds for most experimental science. Can't observe it, making it out of bounds for most experimental science. Entropy, however, we observe every weekend. The early Darwinists like Herbert Spencer thought that if biological evolution occurred, then certainly there must be a social and historical evolution. Do human affairs generally just get better and better by the mere passing of time? From at least the time of Herodotus, humans have engaged in investigations, which is roughly what is meant by the Greek word historia. Investigations about human behavior in society and individually. What makes for a good life? What makes for a good society? Can a human being grow in virtue? Is it inevitable that he will grow in virtue? Can a human being grow in virtue and then fall prey to vice? If so, how can this happen? Is your life evolving to higher and higher moral norms day by day? Are you better on Tuesday than you were on Monday? It is in Herodotus, and quoted by Aristotle in his Ethics, that we read that a man's life cannot be regarded as happy until he has died. This we learn from an exchange between Solon, an Athenian lawgiver, and Croesus, the king of Lydia. Solon tells Croesus that the happiest man he knew, when he was asked by Solon, was Tellus of Athens. He lived in a prosperous city. He had fine and noble sons. He saw his grandchildren born. He died bravely in a battle defending Athens, and the city honored him publicly after his death. Tellus is the happiest person he's known. Why must we wait until a man's death to assess his happiness? It seems crazy. But this is what the tradition tells us. Human life is uncertain. Fortune is unstable and changeable. Many who are rich and powerful end in ruin. Therefore, one must not call a man happy until his life is complete and he passes on. Are you happy? Good. But let's see how it plays out until you die. That's beginning with the end in mind. We can trace this back at least to Basil of Caesarea, who said in his short book addressed to young Greek scholars, and I quote him, "We, my children, in no wise conceive this human life of ours to be an object of value in any respect, nor do we consider anything good at all which makes its contribution to this life of ours only. Our hopes lead us forward to a more distant time, and everything we do is by way of preparation for the other life. He might have said, the next life. This is echoed again by W. Kane in his book, An Essay Toward Education. He says about education, all its significance comes from that which it aims. And all its details are measured by the definitive test of furthering an eternal achievement. So we know something practical in this principle of education with death in view and even the next life. This life is fleeting. It is. And we will all die whether we believe in the next life or not. Or as Franz Kafka said somewhere, the meaning of life is that it stops. We read similar things in Herodotus, and we can certainly see it in the dialogue Phaedo when Socrates happily drinks the hemlock, and we encounter it again in Ecclesiastes. The reality of death in Latin is memento mori, remember to die. And it prompts us to ask good questions about what constitutes a meaningful life. And it bears directly upon education. How shall we live in our few short years? Our few short years under the sun. How shall we treat our neighbors if we regard them as fleeting also? And even more if we regard them as immortal souls. Solon was right that a man's life could deteriorate and decay over time, even if he started well and rose high. Anyone who rises can fall, as we know not just from the books we read, but from personal observation. The passage of time does not make for progress by definition, not for persons, and not for periods, and not for education. Periods of time, nations, empires may start well, rise, and also fall. Tomorrow does not guarantee a better day, even though it's just a day away. Calling to mind the musical Annie. Tomorrow, tomorrow, I love you tomorrow. Where is Babylon today? Where is Egypt of the pharaohs? Where is the empire of Alexander, the empire of Rome? Where is imperial Japan or the Third Reich? The late and great historian Jacques Barzun, who died, by the way, in 2012 at the age of 104, even Barzun had to depart this life. He masterfully reminds us of these realities in his book, Dawn to Decadence. He says he is no prophet, but he thinks that we are declining as a civilization and will continue to do so unless there is some kind of unexpected renewal. But he's not without hope. In one place he says this about scholarship and learning, a bit of hope. The great idea of a university or of scholarship will not die. It will hibernate. It will hibernate, and on reawakening will suggest to its renovators the plain duties that they should take on. We might say that classical education, since 1890 or so, has been hibernating or sleeping underground during the winter of the last 100 years or so. It's now waking up. If we extend the analogy, we in the classical education renewal are waking up ourselves, waking up and walking, but still rubbing the sleep from our eyes. And we need a good cup of coffee, a triple espresso, flat white, please. If we are like animals or daffodils waking up, it also means that we are part of a tradition that is reemerging and resuming. We are like homeowners who discover that the previous owners of our house planted seeds in the soil that we knew nothing of until the flowers appeared in the spring, and we received the blessing, the beauty, and the benefit on account of the labor and service of those who preceded us and who had planted. That happened at our house. The daffodils came up one spring after we bought the house in the winter. We had no idea. In the story that I'm telling, we witness the passing down of a tradition of heirloom seeds that blessed Americans with many splendid flowers. And Andrew, that video in 5 minutes or so showed that, didn't it? Flowers, blooming, good things that have come to America and grew up in a particular kind of garden. Great gardens of learning were created, though never complete, never perfect. Educational gardens of various kinds have been created, from vital homeschooling to town grammar schools, to small colleges, to one-room schoolhouses on the prairie. Much of that good remains, much has passed as well, but anything can be recovered. But before we consider the American story of classical education, we have to note the seed bearers that came before. Someone mentioned Rome, Athens, Jerusalem. There's a backstory, and we have to know it. Humans naturally want to pass on whatever that they've received that they think is good to their children. I'll risk stating that as a universal principle. If you have been blessed with something good, and then you have children, which is also something good, then you'll want to hand it down. You want your son or daughter to know this blessing, this good thing. Whatever it is that has helped you or delighted you, you try to hand it down. And this principle of handing down good things we might also call tradition. Tradition comes from the Latin tradere, which means to hand over or hand down, passed down. The same is true of practices, like the way we celebrate birthdays, Thanksgiving, or Christmas. And if you came to our house, you'd find that most presents are distributed in it. The Roman state did not begin to decay until the family decayed. It must be repeated that schools do not lead social changes, but they follow them. The school of life always dominates the school of formula. Parents hand down not only coats and recipes, but those most essential lessons that every human being requires to commence an education. What is that? Lessons in language. In our case, the English tongue. The greatest illustration of tradition that is blind to most of us. To those of us who are inclined to deny the importance of tradition, they must find themselves in the awkward position of debunking tradition, using words and a capacity for words that were passed down to them carefully and repeatedly as a tradition, first with pointed finger and then with incessant and continuing verbal instruction patiently. If you're a parent, you naturally and with delight and without prompting begin teaching your daughter words, words, words. And what a delight when she speaks them back to you in her own novel combinations and intonations, right? I've got 2 grandchildren. It's happening all the time. I could tell you stories. Language is acquired word by word as a tradition. Someone taught us our tongue. Without this initial education, there can be no, or at least very little education. You have heard the maxim that students learn to read so that they can read to learn. But there's a preceding maxim. A child must speak and understand words if anything's to follow. A child requires a tongue before a book. A child's mother is the primal teacher, and let us thank our mothers now for the words we know so well that it appears that we were just born with them. Recognizing that language is a tradition and acquired by tradition is a first principle that establishes a key element of education. Education is handed down by someone to someone else. Looked on from up high, education is the transmission of the soul of society from one generation to another. So said G.K. Chesterton. Looked close up, it's telling the truth to the last baby born. Also Chesterton. Note that the soul of society is something that we have to regard as good if we're going to pass it down, even as we regard truth-telling as good, whether to a baby or an adult. And this leads to yet another principle. A society, if it is a society, always wants to perpetuate itself. It wants to endure. You will not find in the history books examples of societies or civilizations that held a vote and decided to annihilate themselves. This doesn't mean that nations don't do things, often foolish things that result in their destruction. They do. Speaking of the British, they didn't respond as wisely and prudently as they should when they got that declaration. Or maybe preceding the declaration. There were some decisions they could have made better and that would have been in their own best interest. This is a corollary to another principle. Humans want to be happy. Humans want to be happy. Try willing your own unhappiness. Aquinas says it's not possible. The Athenians wanted to extend their ideals to the next generation, as did the Persians. So what are our ideals? The ideals of a nation almost always end up incarnated in schools, in a curriculum. The Greek paideia was developed over centuries as a means of passing down Greek culture, the Greek way of thinking, living, and dying. And yes, they too studied how to die. We can trace the Greek curriculum, note its beginnings, witness the consolidation, observe its transmission. It is recognizable today as incorporated in our liberal arts. This is what remains and has been passed down to us. The liberal arts of grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy. The Greeks. The Romans imported the Greek paideia as their educatio, giving it particular Roman twists, blending the speculative idealism of the Greeks with their own virtues of austerity, frugality, severity, and order. And of course, the Romans not only gave us the word education, which to them meant the rearing and raising up of a child into full functioning adulthood, they gave us the word traditio, tradition. Chesterton calls tradition the democracy of the dead, for even the dead should have a vote in our meetings and councils. The Romans conquered the Greeks, but their captives then captured them culturally. The Romans witnessed the cultural treasures of the Greeks, and they decided to pass them on to themselves. Not with self-congratulatory victory cries, but with a kind of piety and respect for what they found. There's a reason Roman architecture looks like Greek architecture, and there's a reason why, after reading Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey, that the Roman Virgil wrote the Aeneid. There would be no Aeneid without the Odyssey, and there'd be no divine comedy without them both. Often the Roman Empire is called the Greco-Roman Empire for this reason. Is this important to what we're doing? This is our genealogy. Most of us know that Christianity emerged in the Greco-Roman Empire, and that by 313 AD it had grown so large that the Emperor Constantine, who was on his way to coming into the church, signed the Edict of Milan that allowed Christians to worship freely. The new church was comprised of all kinds of ethnicities, but they were largely Roman subjects, and they generally spoke Greek in the east and Latin in the west. Just as the Romans had incorporated the culture of the Greeks, so did the church incorporate and subsume the language, culture, and curriculum of the Greeks and the Romans, as well as the Jewish culture. The church received all that it thought good from the Greco-Roman tradition, and it placed it squarely into the church. It turned basilicas into temples, basilicas and temples into churches, and replaced the worship of goddesses with the veneration of Mary, turned wells into baptismal fonts, and organized bishoprics according to the Roman political jurisdictions, so that where there was formerly a Roman governor, there was now a bishop. The language of Homer, Plato, Aristotle, Virgil, Cicero, and Seneca became the language of the church and its liturgy, preaching, and theological writings. The church, too, was in an important sense Greco-Roman. We might say that it was traditional. It sought to incorporate all that it found good from the Greco-Roman and Jewish inheritance. In it, the dead spoke. The church spread throughout Europe, such that we can safely call the early and late Middle Ages Christendom, which ought not to be controversial. The cathedrals and churches that still dot Europe are evidence of this. Where the Christians went, they brought their ideals with them, and this meant their educational ideals, their curriculum, their own adapted version of the Greek paideia and Roman educatio, or humanitas. Yes, one of the most common words for education in the Roman vocabulary, the Latin vocabulary, was humanitas. Humanitas meant education. It meant educating a child to become a fully functioning adult, to be humanized. The Catholic lands of Europe prior to the Reformation adopted ways of teaching and learning that continued a course of studies recognizably still Greek and Roman, though transformed in various ways by biblical teaching. Grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, music. Theology became the governing discipline or queen. The church widened the scope of who could access this education, though it was not easily available and affordable to all, though generally improving over time. Access improving. The education took root throughout Europe, and certainly it did in England, and you can see where I'm going now. In fact, the light of learning burned bright in England at a difficult time on the European continent, around 800 AD, when learning was diminishing for various reasons. And you may have heard of the learned and devoted Alcuin of York, who was recruited by Charlemagne to help revise and renew learning in Europe. It was needed then, that renewal, just as it's needed now. The curriculum of the liberal arts, literature, philosophy, and now theology prospered in England. Englishmen, even after the Reformation, did not refer to their curriculum and pedagogy, by the way, as classical education. That word didn't exist at the time. The phrase is a... We all know that the English were the first to come to America and in the largest numbers to settle America. Recalling the Puritans in New England inherited the grammar school from England. Grammar school meant more than just learning grammar. It meant learning grammar so that one could read and study. Read and study what grammar made possible. Literature of all types. Some etymology here is fun. Gramma is the Greek word for letter. Gramma means letter. We speak of learning your letters. And we know that letters form words, and words form sentences, and sentences combine to form literature of all kinds. Literature literally means something that's composed of letters. It's used for a long time, and it refers to learning derived from books of all kinds, poetry, philosophy, theology, as well as books on mathematics and science. So in this era, studying literature meant to study just about everything. Anything good that was written, even mathematics and science. And when the Puritans created grammar schools, they intended that their children would study all kinds of literature, though they naturally selected books according to their level and ability. Sometimes they called grammar schools Latin schools, because students also learned their letters in the Latin language, so they could eventually read Latin literature. They learned Latin and English side by side, and this was done in England in the 1600s. The simultaneous study of Latin and English illuminates both languages. One's English improves on account of the Latin, and one's Latin is facilitated by the English tongue. The Puritans under Jonathan Winthrop landed in Massachusetts Bay in 1630, and within 5 years, they started the Boston Latin School. And by 1636, they founded Harvard College to train ministers for the colony. By 1642, a law was passed requiring heads of households to educate their children. Mandated homeschooling. By 1647, every town of 50 households was required to hire a teacher so children could read and write. And towns of 100 households were required to found and operate a grammar school. These were good schools. These were like good K through 12 schools. Harvard started as a small college with fewer than 10 students and was small for a long time, gradually grew over 2 centuries, and after maybe 200 years, rose to a range of maybe 200 to 300 students. By about 1770, there were 9 colleges that enrolled about 1,500 students in the entire 13 colonies. In all of America, meaning less than 1% of Americans were enrolled in a college. One can get a good education without going to college. Have you noticed that? That was the case in early America. The clearest and most interesting survey of this fact is de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, published in 1835. And he marvels at the literacy and learnedness among the general population, far surpassing what he had seen in France. He notes that America had fewer deeply educated intellectuals. And the French love that. But a kind of popular intellect was in America and was in a class of its own. As we might suspect, however, he was not commenting on the education of the African American population. There may be no American family through which we can watch this transmission and gradual transmutation than the 4 generations of these Adams men. The Adams family. What a family, a storied family. Across 4 generations, John Adams, John Quincy Adams, Charles Francis Adams, and Henry Adams, we see not merely a lineage of statesmen, but a lineage of schooling and education. Through their schooling, we glimpse the larger story of American education. So I'll use them to tell the story of American education. John Adams, born 1735, died in 1826, is our second president, a signer of the Declaration. He was formed in the full confidence of a classical education. course, it wasn't called that back then. It was a liberal education. At Harvard, he studied Latin and Greek, Cicero and Virgil, rhetoric, logic, moral philosophy. The ancients were not antiquarian curiosities to him. They were his living tutors. Rome to him was not nostalgia, it was instruction. For Adams, classical education formed men capable of liberty. Liberty, he wrote, cannot be preserved without a general knowledge among the people. Knowledge was not ornamental, it was the safeguard of self-government. The classical curriculum at that time did not merely inform him, it formed and shaped his moral imagination. Cicero trained prudence, Tacitus warned against tyranny, Scripture formed conscience. Education for John Adams was about forming citizens capable of sustaining a republic. Civic, moral, and theological all at once. And he transmitted this inheritance to his son, John Quincy, with urgency. He took John Quincy with him everywhere. John Quincy Adams, born in 1767 and died in 1848. He was a senator, traveled with Quincy all over Europe. He became our 5th president, and he may have been the most intensely educated child in early America. He spent years with John Adams in France and became fluent in French as a boy and was even training adults in French on ships when he was a teenager. He was tutored abroad while accompanying his father, steeped in Latin and Greek, fluent in French, disciplined in history and moral philosophy. He kept a diary like his father did, almost a daily journal. He was like a young Christian Stoic, constantly meditating and reflecting on his life. Classical education for him was not merely preparation for office, but for judgment. He once wrote with sober self-examination, "My whole life has been a succession of disappointments." This is not the language of ambition that was thwarted. It's the language of a man measuring himself against the inherited standards of a life of virtue and wisdom. His education, his liberal education, had taught him to live under the gaze of history and of God. In John Quincy Adams, the classical tradition reaches a kind of zenith. It was cosmopolitan. He had been to Russia as well, and Germany. Disciplined, morally serious, confident that the past still instructs the present. By the time we arrive to Charles Francis Adams, born in 1807 and died in 1886, this inheritance remains, but something is beginning to thin. He too was educated at Harvard like his father and grandfather. Charles Francis is the son of John Quincy. He too traveled along with his father, and he later became ambassador to England. He too read the classics. He preserved family papers, wrote history, served the public as an ambassador to England during the Civil War years. But the intellectual climate was starting to shift. Romanticism was stirring, industrialization is accelerating, professional specialization began to fragment the older moral unity. And the classical curriculum was still there, but it no longer stood uncontested as the center of cultural life. And then comes his son, Henry Adams. There's 3 books I read for this talk. Yeah, another advertisement. Follow me on Substack. This essay is now on Substack and will be at the On Classical Ed Substack as well. Here's what I'm trying to get to. Henry Adams. With him, the fracture becomes visible. Born in 1838, died in 1918. He too was educated at Harvard. He traveled abroad extensively as well with his father. Note the pattern? But he felt himself born too late for the world that formed his forefathers. He said he writes about himself in the 3rd person in his autobiography, The Education of Henry Adams. Writing about himself, he says, he was born in the 18th century and he had to live in the 20th. The education that helped shape his great-grandfather for Republican liberty no longer seemed adequate for railroads, the set, not the figure. The figure, the human person, becomes almost incidental to Adams. Education is no longer primarily about forming the soul. It's about testing the garments, the clothing. And for Henry, the educational garments of the 18th century no longer fit the 19th or the 20th. And then comes this telling line. Writing of himself, he says, the young man in which Cicero in Scripture still spoke meaningfully into political life. But Henry stands before the electric dynamo. He sees this at one of those fairs. Can you imagine standing in front of the first electric generator? He says it was like 15 feet tall and almost silent as it spun. It changed him, observing these massive machines that were just transforming culture and society. The power plant, the mechanical symbol of modernity, and he feels that the older curriculum can't even interpret it. It doesn't know what to say about it, just like we don't know what to say about AI right now. We don't know what to do with it. That's our electric dynamo today. And he said, my past education is of no value to help me understand Darwinian evolution and the electric dynamo. He famously contrasts the medieval Virgin Mary, the symbol of spiritual unity, with the modern dynamo, the symbol of impersonal force. He taught medieval history at Harvard. He went to all the cathedrals that were all dedicated to Mary, and he saw no dedication to Mary in the United States. He saw the dynamo. He saw the Virgin uniting culture in medieval Europe, and he saw nothing bringing coherence to America, just the attempt to manage these immeasurable, unimaginable new forces. The Virgin represented a world in which education ordered the soul towards transcendence. The dynamo represented a world in which education must adapt to acceleration, technological acceleration. This is the hinge for Adams. In Henry Adams, we witness not yet the full architecture of progressive education, not in this book, but we recognize its psychological precondition. If the world is no longer stable, if energy rather than virtue is the operative category, if change rather than continuity defines the age, then education must prepare students for flux, ongoing flux. It must be adaptive, practical, forward-looking. The curriculum must loosen. The authority of tradition must soften. And the aim shifts from transmission of culture to preparation for a rapidly changing material and technological world. That's the progressive education that rose in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And it's still with us today, is it not? And yet here's the irony. Henry Adams' very lament in his book, The Education of Henry Adams, is classical in its tone. His prose is measured, and it won a Pulitzer Prize. It's very well written. He's a very good writer. His moral seriousness is unmistakable. His disappointment assumes that education ought to make sense of the world. His crisis testifies to the greatness of what he had inherited, because one does not mourn what one has never loved. Look at his face. He was a confused man, a sad man, full of lamentation. His wife, in the prime of his life, took her own. He lost his sister. And in the Adams family, there was another suicide and other deaths. There was a lot to mourn. But he, looking into the future, did not see a future of hope and coherence. He saw things fragmenting and coming apart. He tried to face it squarely. He believed in Darwinian material evolution and the advent of force, and he develops a history of a dynamic theory of history, which basically a new way of thinking about history is just the application of physical forces determining our destiny rather than moral will. Across these 4 generations, then, we see something profound. John Adams had that classical education that would preserve and create liberty. John Quincy Adams, a classical education that was a disciplined moral vocation. Charles Francis Adams begins to thin education that preserved itself but with modern currents and change. And Henry Adams, classical education that was strained to the breaking point by modern fragmentation. This transmission does not occur overnight. This collapse does not occur overnight. It thins, it shifts, it begins to translate itself into new categories. It's hard to generalize about it. Eventually, in Henry's world, the confidence that education transmits a stable moral inheritance gives way to this question: how must education change to keep up with the double-time march of history that's determined by material cause? The Addams Family tells a story of America's educational arc, from confident classical formation to anxious modern adaptation. And yes, it involves a good bit of utilitarianism. Americans aren't famous in philosophy except for pragmatism. And as Chesterton says, the most pragmatic thing that we can really do is not to be a pragmatist. Perhaps their story leaves us with a question of our own. If the garments no longer seem to fit, is the answer to abandon the form altogether? Or is it to recover the measure of the human being for whom they were first woven? Yes, we return to anthropology. What is a human being? We return to that center. What do we believe a human is? It had changed for Henry Adams. C.S. Lewis says that when we have lost our way in the woods, the quickest way forward is to return home. And the first to make that turnabout is the most progressive man. W. Kane notes that the history of education is always the history of new beginnings. And Chesterton notes that every revolution is a restoration. We move forward truly and best only by inspiration from the past. And the past is not dead. In fact, the past is not even past. It's still with us. T.S. Eliot writes about this. He says in one of his 4 quartets, "We shall not cease from exploring, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and to know that place for the first time." That's why the return to classical education seems so novel and new, so cool and so hip, because we haven't seen it for a while. And as it's being reincarnated, it is new and it is cool. So that's where we are now. We're now at our own new beginning. If the history of education is a history of new beginnings, we're beginning anew. Henry Adams died in 1980 in the midst of the war to end all wars, using massive machinery that he saw quickly invented and deployed in his lifetime, which took him from his life from the horse and buggy to the airplane. He saw forces that he studied and feared played out in ways that stunned the watching world. America had become a great power, and England was no longer looking to it as a younger cousin, but as a needed and stronger ally. The British Empire was shrinking. The American one was rising. What kind of education was needed now? And while Henry had ambivalently welcomed the new progressive education, he didn't think there was any other choice. He was not sure that the new model that was emerging was healthy or good. You can see it in his eyes. This is all we got. What other alternative do we have? Henry received, it was inevitable. The irony of the education Henry received is a common one. He received the older education which equipped him superbly and eloquently to reject it and to adapt it and to adapt himself and find other ways in the world. He did that pretty well as a professor, a writer, a journalist, and an author. It's not unheard of to hear about great rhetoricians who use rhetoric to eloquently critique rhetoric and the liberal education they've received. As far back as Tertullian and Jerome, and nearly all the famous progressive pioneers used their eloquent pens to deride the arts that made them. We have to do it for a time. I know you don't like modern education for several reasons, but what are you for? It's easier to critique modern education than to know and recover the classical tradition. We often choose the path of least resistance, the easy way. The renewal of classical education is not going to be sustained by the negative energy of critique any more than a friendship can be sustained by two people who are mad at the same person. The progressives, like Henry, were responding to unprecedented change, wave upon wave. Darwinian evolution suggesting that natural forces rather than human will were responsible for human destiny and history. Waves of technological change. We don't really understand it. You have to keep reading this history. The train, the steamship, the telegraph, the telephone, electricity, the factory, the automobile, the airplane. All happening during this time. all suggesting to many that humans could engineer and remake virtually everything, because we were. We were flying, ladies and gentlemen. We were flying in the sky. So why couldn't we re-engineer education and turn it into a science? Add to this massive immigration of millions of people, many of whom do not speak English, doubling and tripling the size of schools in short spans of time. What would you have done? What would you have done? And would you have done better? What did they get right? Well, they saw in the midst of this remarkable change that traditional institutions did need to adapt, and they were willing to try. They noted that traditionalists were slow to adapt and often calcified, sometimes even ossified, stodgy and stuffy. Why? Well, because anything good can be corrupted, and in many cases, it had been. You might not have been so happy to see some of the examples of classical education that they were observing. In many cases, the tradition remained vibrant, however, and sought to make a cogent case for the classics and classical education. Even in 1917, when Andrew West, professor of classics at Princeton, published a book called The Value of the Classics with many essays from many different people in walks of life, defending the classical tradition. But it was too little, and it was too little too late. Generally, the traditional educators were caught flat-footed and outmaneuvered, blinking their eyes as a new generation of educational scientists took over first Columbia Teachers College, and then in the space of 30 years, took over much of the nation. It took them 30 years, and classical education was well on its heels and well on its way out. The theory of the progressives was flawed at the foundation, however. They were thinking that education could be transformed into a purely and wholly quantitative science, when it can't be, since it's primarily an art, as raising and cultivating humans has to be. Surely education is informed by science, but education is the cultivation of wisdom, virtue, and piety by means of the liberal arts and the great books and the community of academic friends. Their premise was flawed. Be careful, the logician says, of the insane first premise, because the rest is logic. Education is not a science. Progressive educators do a number of things right, and perhaps mainly because there are a lot of good people who love children in progressive schools, and they earnestly seek to help children. Despite progressive theory, they do much good. But education is not wholly a science, though blessed by the findings of science. And that assumption ensures ongoing tinkering with a machine that will never work. It's like trying to build a perpetual motion machine. And we've been tinkering ever since. There's always a new fad, a new pedagogy, new research, database findings, etc. And how has that worked out? Since education is complex, it's the cultivation of a child, it's easy to reason wrongly about it. It's easy to generalize and say that the part characterizes the whole, as people are doing right now with AI. AI is a hydra with 1,000 heads. It's not one thing. When education consists of many parts, and it's in a complex synergy. No, classical education is not merely the incorporation of Latin into the curriculum. No, progressive education is nothing but child-selected curricula and project-based learning. It's complex, ladies and gentlemen. Much educational heresy is simply taking things out of their natural human balance, taking good things out of balance. Thus, we're forced to pit a child against the teacher and choose either child-centered or teacher-centered classrooms. We are told we must teach the child, not the subject, as if it's not possible to teach a subject to a child. We are made to choose between hands-on learning and whole class instruction, or between discovery learning and direct instruction. That's like insisting you must choose between breakfast and lunch, or Monday and Tuesday, because plainly you can't have them both. This you might recognize as the bifurcation fallacy applied to teaching. In theological terms, a heresy is often a truth held out of balance, and it is always some genuine truth that gives plausibility to any heretical pedagogy. Therefore, the free school, you heard of the free schools? In our town we call it the circle school. The free schools in which the child chooses what to study and when seems plausible because it is true that we should encourage children to explore and pursue their growing interests, shouldn't we? Well, let's do that all the time, everywhere. Thus, affirming virtually all student performance. Affirming students is a good thing. Everybody gets an A. That seems plausible too, because affirmation does in fact encourage the children. 4 + 5 = 8. That's only one number away, Johnny. That's pretty good. Just as common is the straw man fallacy, in which we trot forth the worst examples of progressive teaching or the worst examples of classical teaching that we can find in order to discredit the whole. But I should stop. All this means is that we need to recover logic and start thinking. The art of using reason well. That's a liberal art. Certainly not some vague critical thinking, which means who knows what. Now, having studied some logic, someone like me can find himself in trouble. And you too. I can start thinking more highly of myself than I ought. I know what bifurcation means. That means false dichotomy. And I know what dichotomy means too. This is a more serious problem than slipping into a fallacy. As Lewis says somewhere, if we teach logic without love, we create more clever devils. Just as our own education can tempt us and puff us up with pride and render us useless as teachers, so can the very success of this renewal of classical education become our own undoing. Pride usually does come before a fall. Classical education is now officially a thing. Have you noticed? It's on the rise on the national scale, and increasingly an international scale too. Some of you might not know about that, but all around there's interest. Many more people than ever before have heard about it, although a year and a half ago, the research indicated that 95% of the population do not know what classical education is, but more are apparently hearing about it. There are now about 1,500 classical schools in the U.S., 3,000 classical homeschooling co-ops, over 300 colleges now accept the classical learning test. That's 7.5% of all colleges, by the way. There's a rapidly growing interest overseas in Africa, China, Europe, South America, and Australia. We might be tempted to rejoice like the Israelites did at the end of the book of Nehemiah, when they held a feast and festival after rebuilding the wall of Jerusalem in just 52 days. And that was a remarkable feat, and Nehemiah is a remarkable book that can instruct all of us. The walls of Jerusalem were built with permission and funding from the king. And we have letters from the king now, don't we? This administration is kind of friendly. King Artaxerxes of Persia gave Nehemiah letters and even a protective military escort. The Israelites returned from exile in 445, some 150 years after they were defeated by the Babylonians in exile. They come back. Aren't we returning from exile? Perhaps that's a pattern worth contemplating alongside the analogies of reawakening from hibernation. Oskinus likes this pattern: exile and return. We should read history for encouragement and instruction, and we should read about the rise and fall of Rome and the Third Reich. We should read the Old and New Testament. A good place. And so what he's saying by inventing this word utopia is that there is no place that is a good place. We're an important part, but we're not the whole. We now expect schools to be the whole. Medical clinics, nutrition centers, counseling centers. There's no one place that can do full education. Some of us are drawn to a utopian outlook, the optimist in the room, of which I confess I'm one. Let me call on the history of Christianity, which I know. Since Augustine and his magnum opus, The City of God and the City of Man, Christians have believed that the wheat and the tare, those inside and outside of the church, would grow up together in the same field of this world, intermingled. For Augustine, it meant that Christians were to serve peaceably with those outside of the church, seeking to be leaven in the bread or salt of the earth. That benefits all. It meant that Christians were to serve, love, and if necessary, die like they did during the plague, serving those who were sick, but always to pray for the peace of the city. There would be no New Jerusalem on this earth until Christ returns. No earthly paradise, certainly no utopia. This means that for those of us who are Christians in the renewal, we should be here to serve, not to rule. It means we should collaborate, not dominate. It certainly means that we should love the land in which we live. And I love that quote that you cited, Andrew. You should love, it's normal and good, to love the land in which you're born. We love the land in which we live, in which we're born, our country and our countrymen. It means that we want the common good, or as Paul puts it in Romans 12, as so far as it depends on you, to live in peace with all men, and even to bless those who persecute us. We who are Christians are instructed to ensure that there are petitions, prayers, and intercession and thanksgiving to be made for everyone, for kings and all those in authority, that we may live quiet and peaceful lives in all godliness and holiness. You might call this Christian patriotism, to love our fatherland, a phrase that I much prefer to Christian nationalism. Think about it. Which of you like to say among your friends, I am a nationalist? But how easy is it to say, I am a patriot. I love my country. But the history of Christian education means something else that should be acknowledged. We who are Christians are heirs of a rich archive of classical education, but we don't own it. Because much of classical education is, first of all, human before it's Christian, because it's, whether it's Jewish, Christian, or secular. Training in the liberal arts, for example, entails training in how to use word and number, which is according to human nature and fitting for any human being. Christians would say that the liberal arts, discovered and developed, by the way, by the Greeks and the Romans before the time of Christ. We would say the liberal arts are rooted in the doctrine of creation. So if you are a human, then the liberal arts are for you, Christian or not. We say the same thing about anything that's true, good, or beautiful. A lovely triad, by the way, describing cosmic reality, articulated first by Plato, but corresponding to biblical teaching. Every human being naturally loves and desires the true, the good, and the beautiful. Every human being should have the opportunity to seek it and to study it with good teachers. And yes, Christians believe the Trinity is the author of all that's true, good, and beautiful. Something Plato obviously didn't say. But we're in agreement with Plato. Is it any surprise that in the history of Christian education, Christians welcomed Christians and non-Christians into Christian schools, including the poor who could pay no tuition? This was true of many monastic schools that educated Europe for centuries, from about 500 to 1400 AD. After all, Christians are supposed to clothe the naked, feed the hungry, take in the stranger. Are they not to teach as well? Are they? The Christian tradition of classical education is rich and it's varied and it's many, though not all of the great books in the classical curriculum come from writers who are Christians, like Augustine or Alcuin, Aquinas, Dante, Milton, Newton, Kepler. But there were many other truth seekers who were not in the church, like Socrates, Maimonides, Thomas Paine, who wrote Common Sense, up to the Declaration, Jefferson, Franklin, David Hume, Spinoza, Nietzsche. And yet we read them. The great tradition is significantly populated with Christian writers, but not exclusively so. Christians and non-Christians can study this tradition together. Faith and reason can be welcomed into a public as well as a private academy. Whatever we make of the separation of church and state issue, there should be no separation of religion and academic study in a classical academy. This means that the classical tradition, though historically steeped in the Christian religion and at various times Jewish and even Muslim, can welcome the seeker as well as the stranger into those schools that are Christian classical schools. Increasingly, this is what Christians are doing, though of course they're free to restrict admission to Christian families only, and the practices here among Christian schools vary for good reasons. It's worth noting that we don't yet know our own history very well. since this tradition has been hibernating or laying dormant underground until warm weather came. There are not yet many of us who have sufficiently read the history of the kind of education we're seeking to restore. This is a necessary irony, though, a necessary part of the renewal. We had to start when we were not qualified to start. How else were we going to start? We had to learn on the job. I remember sitting in my office as a young headmaster realizing that I couldn't name the liberal arts. I couldn't get them all down. And then I realized I didn't know why they were called arts and not sciences. And I realized I didn't know the difference between an art and a science. Do you? This is how we had to start, learn on the job. We stayed one chapter ahead of our students. But that was nearly a generation ago. And matters are starting to change. But how many of you even know an outline of history of this tradition and its recent renewal? How many of you know the history, the general history? How many of you know the history of the last 45 years? We're still learning it. It's understandable that we're ignorant, but we need to know now. We need to know now. It's the stage we're at. We were reawakened about 45 years ago, scarcely the span of one generation ago. We can trace the beginning of the renewal to 4 schools that started independently from each other within 3 years. To my knowledge, thanks to my colleague Nate Antiel, who brought this to my attention, the first school was the Trivium School, a Catholic school in Lancaster, Massachusetts, founded in 1979. How have they flown under the radar all these years? Cair Paravel, Latin school, founded in 1980 in Topeka, Kansas. And the DNA of that school descended from Columbia University to the University of Kansas to Cair Paravel. Brian, where's your hand? Where's Brian Williams? He was a teacher at Cair Paravel in his early career. Where's Nate? Nate's standing, sitting. Nate's the guy who found out that Trivium is the first school, as far as we know. It started in 1979. We're still doing educational archaeology. Then there was the Logos School of Moscow, started in 1981, Moscow, Idaho, and Trinity Christian Academy in Greenlawn, Indiana. Both of these schools started in 1981. And the DNA of Trinity was transplanted in some ways to Great Hearts Academies. And the DNA of Logos has been placed into many of the Protestant and Reformed classical schools that are a part of the Association of Classical Christian Schools. And in the mid-1990s, the Society of Classical Learning started to serve classical Christian schools that had been growing and has been growing robustly. I would say it's a little more inclusive than the ACCS. It's not just Reformed. And colleges have been renewing in parallel with K-12 schools. The ecosystem now includes publishers, networks of schools, charter schools, Catholic schools, Protestant schools, Orthodox schools, a few Jewish schools starting, and homeschool co-ops, along with new efforts to help the vast majority of Americans who have never heard of classical education and don't understand it. The Humanitas Institute is trying to reach the 95% of the population who just don't know. And I encourage you to look at some of the videos. And now that we can drink, we're tempted to drink too much. Our success, like a good old-fashioned, can go to our head. Is coming. And in central Pennsylvania, where I live, and even in Hawaii, where a classical school there studies Latin and Japanese, the flowers there are tropical. This marks health. Yes, there's a need for preparing and training thousands of new teachers. Yes, there's a need for good and better curricular resources. Yes, there's a need for leadership training, funding, and excellent operations. But no single organization can curate this sprawling garden in this new spring. No one owns the garden. If anyone owns it, it's humanity. For humanity made it. Even if we Christians believe humanity made it by the grace and benevolence of God. Humans made it and passed it down. Naturally, as we co-labor, we have to concentrate on our particular garden patch or plot. And this means at times we will compete for resources. And we'll find ourselves occasionally stepping on the boot of a fellow gardener. But competition need not be viewed as a negative win-loss affair. The Latin competere means to seek along with. Competition only becomes negative when there are two people seeking some good for which there is only room for one. But if we all climbed the summit of Mount Washington, we would find that we could all climb it together, we could compete, and there would be room for all of us at the top. We at Classical Academic Press compete with several other classical curricula companies like Memoria Press, which is here, another great company. We're MAC, their PC. Both good. And I'm glad to say that we are colleagues and friends seeking the same thing and finding it. Visit all of our tables. But if you want free evaluation copies of our text, hurry to the cap table while supplies last. I conclude, people have come to America. Perhaps your people have come to America. There's a peppy song in the musical West Side Story where Anita and her friends from Puerto Rico sing about how happy they are to be in America. We want to be in America. It is okay in America. Everything's free in America. For a small fee in America. America has been seeded with good seeds from Puerto Rico and from virtually every country on the planet. And there is another reason why we are a garden growing wild and truly e pluribus unum. In the Roman Colosseum, there were gladiator fights, other games, and even martyrdoms. Often exotic animals from around the world were brought into the arena, which is the Latin for sand, by the way, to astonish the Roman spectators. After the Christian era, when the games were ended about 500 AD, beautiful and unknown flowers and fauna began to appear on the grounds of the arena, which became a kind of wild garden, an astonishment of an unexpected kind. Seeds traveled on the fur and in the stomachs of many animals brought into the Colosseum, many of which were killed in simulated hunts. The seeds mixed with their blood and over years eventually germinated and sprouted in the Colosseum, which had been a place of frivolous games, hunts, and even martyrdoms, becoming a garden, something beautiful. And I see America as a kind of vast arena. Heirloom seeds have come from the great tradition from many lands over many years. So many seeds which have remained buried in the soil are coming to life. And we should be grateful for this gift. For we came here to find this inheritance preserved for us and handed down by those who came before us. Plutarch said that education is not the filling of a vessel, but the kindling of a fire. And that was said some 1,800 years ago. Another principle handed down to us, which describes human experience, and it remains so true today. All of us have, as it were, a flame in our hearts that needs to grow brighter. Every school is a blend of those flames which creates its own indescribable, incandescent beauty. When this kind of illuminated school exists, like other beautiful things, you really can't describe it well, can you? I recall learning this as a young headmaster. It was far more effective to show the school to a prospective parent than to talk about it. Once I gave a tour to a young mom of a kindergartner or first grader who, after the tour of the school, said to me, "I didn't know that this is what I was looking for, but this is what I'm looking for." She was weeping. She saw children who loved their teacher and who loved one another and who were at peace. She saw earnest attention and conversation. She saw happy chatter and shouts of glee on the playground. But as you know, if you're at a school like this, these words fail to describe the beauty of a vibrant classical school that is truly good in the deepest moral sense of that word. What that mother saw was wonder and love and genuine friendship. But words don't do justice. You have to see it. So I encourage you to let love for this present life and the life that's to come fix your aims, focus your work, fire your hearts. If that happens in your school, your teachers will become a faculty of friends whom students admire and naturally emulate. Preserve and tend this fire that's been rekindled for you. Let it grow in your school so that each child becomes a shining lamp that collectively illuminates your school like a candlelight vigil that attracts others by its beauty. Let that beauty draw others in, and then watch beauty do its eternal work of leading us all to goodness and truth. Thank you for your kind attention. Yeah, thank you. No questions.
Thank you so much, Chris. And in particular, thank you for moving that talk from Friday to Wednesday. I'm now retitling it Wednesday Addams. Please join me one more time in thanking Chris Perrin. You are all invited out to the courtyard for some beautiful weather, some great food, and more importantly, some amazing company. Please meet somebody that you haven't met. Introduce yourself to someone from Great Hearts. Tell us your story. Find Chris Perrin. Tell him your story. We'll see you out there.